Tesla's Attic, chapters 15 and 16. Chapter 15, The Burden of Beyond Weird. The meteor shower that hit the sports complex was all the talk at school the next day. Even though there was absolutely no news coverage, word of mouth had spread quickly, devolving into misinformation until a few simple chunks of rock had become aliens in the outfield. Ralphie Sherman claimed to have actually seen one. All three of its heads looked me in the eye. Then it ripped off my wallet and escaped on a public bus. But no one believed him because everyone knew the buses didn't run past 9. For Nick, the mundane workings of middle school were a pleasant, if somewhat numbing escape from the issues of cosmic intrigue. Then Vince arrived with a set of croquet mallets. "Here," he said, handing the whole set over to Nick. "If I pick these up on the way to school, you owe me $43." They looked like ordinary croquet mallets. There was a reason for that. "These weren't from my attic," said Nick. "What?" "But I heard the guy telling people he got them at a garage sale." Nick shrugged. "Not mine." "So what am I going to do with croquet mallets?" "Stop right there." They turned to see Petula glowering at them with steely intensity. "Are those croquet mallets?" "Indeed they are," said Vince. "No one plays croquet anymore," Petula said, "which means more scholarship money for me. How much do you want for them?" Ultimately, Vince cut his losses by selling the mallets to Petula for $20. It was during the last period of the day that Nick was called in once more to Principal Watt's office. He offered Nick his deepest condolences. "What do you mean?" asked Nick, gripping the arms of his chair. "What happened?" "It's your mighty Morphin permanent record," the principal said. "I have good news and bad news. The good news is you are no longer from Denmark. You did, in fact, attend Tampa Heights Middle School." "Okay, and?" "The bad news is you were labeled deceased as of February 12th." The significance of that date was instantly clear to Nick. It was the date of the fire. The air conditioning in the room suddenly felt very cold. "My brother, too?" "You'll have to take that up with the elementary school." Then, from a manila folder, he withdrew a sheet of paper and handed it to Nick. It was a death certificate. "I must say it disturbs me that you are officially dead, Mr. Slate. This is not that kind of school." Nick looked it over. Whoever created it had taken great pains to make it look real. But why? He found the answer at the bottom of the page, where there was a small, hand-printed A crossed by the symbol for infinity. It was a warning, a threat. The Accelerate, whatever they were, now knew that Nick knew. And if they had the power to mess with his school records, there was no telling what else they could mess with. "It's someone's idea of an April Fool's joke," Nick told Principal Watt. "That's all." "It's a few weeks late for April Fools." "Not Chinese April Fools. Keep watching my file," he told the principal as he got up to leave. "I'm sure next week I'll be alive. But from Mars." The sound of clattering pots and pans when Nick arrived home meant that his dad was cooking again. Nick realized that the end of the world must be upon them, because his father preparing a home-cooked meal 2 nights in a row was surely a sign of the apocalypse. On his way toward the kitchen, Nick caught sight of Danny in the living room, sitting on the floor wrestling with a video game controller, which Danny often did these days because of their lamentable lack of cable. On the screen, heads were exploding, the result of some supercharged weapon that might or might not have had a real life cousin from Nick's attic. It was the first time Nick had seen his brother since last night's flaming parade of heavenly bodies. He hesitated at the arched threshold of the living room, knowing that any move toward Danny would feel like walking on eggshells. "Hey," he said softly. "I don't want to talk about it," snapped Danny. "That's okay," said Nick. "I wasn't going to ask." Danny paused the game and looked at Nick. His eyes were searching for something in his brother, but whatever Danny was searching for, Nick knew it wasn't there. I want to pretend it never happened, but I can't, Danny said, and then he gazed down at the faded carpet for a few moments before saying, "There's something wrong with this place, isn't there?" "Not wrong," Nick answered, "just weird." "No," Danny said, a little irritated. "My principal's comb over is weird. Our neighbor and her dog in matching sweaters are weird. But this?" "Good point," said Nick, thinking back to Mitch's appraisal. "Let's just say it is what it is." Danny returned to his game, but his heart wasn't in it, and his avatar accidentally blew up his own head. "So, was it just a baseball glove or all the stuff in the attic?" Danny asked. Nick thought about lying in order to shield his brother, but Danny had probably figured out the answer already. "I know this is scary, Danny," he said, "but you know what? Everything in the world is scary until you understand it." "Do you understand it?" "No," Nick said, "so I'm scared too." "Really?" "Yeah. But I think it would be easier if you let me be scared for both of us." Danny considered the wisdom of that, and he nodded. "I can do that." Then he restarted his game, content to let Nick bear the burden of all the things beyond weird. Nick stepped into the kitchen where his father was now singing. It sounded almost Italian, but it fell short with a lot of dum-de-dums where the Italian words were supposed to be. Pasta was obviously on the menu. "I found a meat sauce recipe online. It got 5 out of 5 stars from 412 people globally." "Right," said Nick. "You okay, Dad?" "More than okay." Mr. Slate stirred the sauce so hard it splattered the wall behind the range. "The job that Jorgensen guy was talking about, turns out it's the real deal. Somehow they heard I'd be a technician in Tampa. Now I'm repairing copy machines at triple the salary for NORAD." "NORAD?" Nick had heard of the North American Aerospace Defense Command, and he knew it was somewhere near Colorado Springs, but he couldn't wrap his mind around the idea of his father working there. It was as unlikely as, well, as Swedberg and Sons, fine jewelers, disappearing into thin air. "I started today. I actually get to go into the mountain." Nick's dad grinned like a kid. "I have security clearance and everything, at least to the places that have copy machines." He drained the pasta while Nick tried to sift through his father's big news. Jorgensen must have connections nosebleed high. If he could put Nick's father into a NORAD job. "Oh, the folks at NORAD explain to me what's going on," his father said. "The baseball mitt is part of some old experimental weapons system. The mitt has a homing chip in it, and the meteorites were actually test missiles in disguise. I guess the idea was to attack an enemy, but to make it look like a random cosmic event. Very controversial. I guess that's why it was scrapped." Nick said nothing. "They're lying to you, Dad," he wanted to say. "They're lying to you to keep you from asking questions. But when the alternative was believing that your 8-year-old son was pulling real meteorites out of the sky, a lie, any lie, becomes a welcome relief." If his father hadn't been so desperate for a simple explanation, he might have realized that if it were true, they never would have told him. Who gives classified military information to the copy machine technician? "Don't know how the thing ended up in our attic," his father continued as he poured the meat sauce on the spaghetti. "Maybe your great Aunt Greta won it in a poker game from some general. I hear she was a wild one back in the day." Nick sat with his father and brother eating his 5-star spaghetti in silence. Yes, his father now had a job, but slipping him into this job was not an act of generosity on the part of Jorgensen. It was a way of keeping an eye on the whole family, a way of telling Nick that if he didn't get with the program, his father may pay the price. Nick had to face the fact that this was all too big for him. It would be wise for him to simply bow out now before someone got hurt. Just give Jorgensen whatever he wanted and never speak of the Accelerati again. Things might have gone that way too if Nick hadn't picked up the sports page after dinner. When he flipped over to the section to check the baseball scores, he found himself looking at the obituary page instead. Nick never really read obituaries. He had a funny superstition about it, fearing that he might see his name, have a coronary, and fulfill the prophecy of his own death. He knew it was ridiculous, but still, the thought of it was enough to keep him from looking. Except this time. And out of the various local dead folks staring back at him from the newspaper, one looked familiar. Nick excused himself and went upstairs to call Caitlin. I found Swedberg, he told her when she answered, the obituary page still in his hand. That's great. Where is he? Will he talk to us? That might be a problem, Nick said. And then a thought occurred to him. Then again, maybe not. Vince's house and his mother were just as cheerfully bright as ever. Vincent, she called down to the basement after greeting Nick and Caitlin at the door. I'm sending your friends down. Please make sure you're decent. Friends, Nick heard Vince say, as if this were a foreign and perhaps unwanted concept. Sure, send them down. Vince was, in fact, not decent. He was wearing briefs in police line colors, and the slogan read Caution. This package is explosive. Caitlin immediately shielded her eyes. Vince! Sorry. He quickly stepped into a pair of torn jeans. Better? Only partially, Caitlin said. Until you have some pectoral muscles, I insist you wear a shirt. Are we clear? Vince sighed and he slipped on a shirt. Nobody appreciates malnutrition chic anymore. The shirt slogan read, Eat your heart out before I do it for you, which was only slightly better than his underwear. Through all of this, Nick chuckled nervously, traumatized by the thought of Caitlin seeing Vince in his skivvies, while simultaneously jealous of Vince for having such a level of optical intimacy with her, even though it was unwanted. Where's the wet cell? Nick asked. I knew you had an agenda, Vince said. I knew you wouldn't visit unless you wanted something. We respect your privacy, said Caitlin, don't we, Nick? Yeah, I mean, we wouldn't want to bother you unless we really had to. Vince looked back and forth between them a few times and then said, I haven't used it for anything stupid. If you must know, I've been conducting experiments with it so I can understand exactly how it works. He sat down on his bed and pulled out a notebook which he began to flip through. It can animate roadkill, but only the parts that haven't been crushed. Caitlin began to look mildly green. Oh, yuck. That goes for possums, raccoons, squirrels. We get the idea, said Nick. What else did you find out? Vince flipped the page. I tried it on a steak. Cooked? No. But raw? Yes. My specimen, a raw New York steak, 12 ounces, began to squirm when the electrodes were applied. Squirm, said Caitlin. Yeah, it started to crawl off the plate, and Caitlin gave him another look, and he quickly turned the page. I took it to the museum the other day, and when no one was looking, I attached it to a dinosaur skeleton. You what? Nick exclaimed. Don't worry, it had no effect on the bones. He shook his head wistfully. Yeah, that would have been sweet. So my theory is the battery can reanimate something when the tissue is in decent shape and still has some sort of muscular integrity. Like the freshly dead, suggested Nick. Both he and Caitlin leaned in closer for the answer. Vince smiled broadly. Where are we going with this, guys? Chapter 16. Man in a Drawer. The fact that Vince knew the location and religious affiliation of every mortuary in town was one of those things he never thought would come in handy, unless, of course, he was ever lucky enough to witness a multi-car pileup or a high casualty natural disaster. Still, he couldn't help but know. His mind was spring-loaded, blood-stained steel trap when it came to tidbits of morbidity. Being that Swedberg was a Scandinavian name, and that all the Scandinavians he knew were Lutheran, Vince reasoned that Swedberg would be chilling at the Clousing and Corkery mortuary in preparation for a funeral later in the week. Hey, Nick, said Vince as they approached the quaint Victorian mortuary. Looks kind of like your house, doesn't it? And noticing Nick's discomfort at the suggestion, he said, Don't worry, I'm sure any bodies at your house are unintentional. Let's just get in and get out, Nick said. So, asked Caitlin, how are we going to get in? Vince handed the heavy wet cell to Nick. The side door has a sticky lock when the weather's been wet, Vince said. Sometimes it doesn't fully engage and can be jimmied open with a credit card. How do you know this? Caitlin asked, a slight tremor in her voice. Well, sometimes when I can't sleep. Stop right there. Caitlin put up her hand. My disturbing image meter is already in the red with the first half of the sentence. Vince shrugged, and he reminded himself that personal information should really only be shared on the need-to-know basis. The side door, not used by the general public, was neglected and weather-worn. Vince put his hand on the doorknob to steady it, and just as he said, the door opened with a little credit card tinkering. Voila! Vince said, holding the door wide open. The others hesitated, not ready to step into the dark space beyond the open door. Don't be such lightweights, he said. There's nothing in there but death. And he strode into the void, knowing that they would follow if he led the way. Vince felt his way down the hall until he reached the alarm panel. From experience, he knew he had 30 seconds to disarm the security system. He had once tripped it accidentally, and then he hid and watched the security guards enter the code. Vince heard the others enter the hallway behind him, and the steel door creaked close as he punched in the numbers by the light of his iPhone. They've got to rent a cop who comes by once an hour or so, he explained. There's no security here now, whispered Nick, looking around. Nah, Vince said. It's not like the guests here need hand holding. We should be okay. But keep your ears peeled in case anyone comes in. Eyes peeled, ears to the ground, Caitlin corrected him, unnerved. Keep your expressions straight. Just be listening, Vince told them. He led them down a stairway and into the prep room. Various tools of the trade hung on the walls, and the sink table was set smack in the middle of a green-tiled floor. Vince held out his hands. This is where it happens, people. The Egyptians did it with sea salt and linen, but now it's formaldehyde and stainless steel. Dude, said Nick, enough. Right, Vince noted that not everyone had as healthy a perspective on life and death as he did. Let's take a look in the chill drawers, shall we? He led them across the room to a series of square refrigerator doors set in the wall. Nick and Caitlin kept a nervous distance. Just tell us when you find him, Nick said. Caitlin's eyes were closed, and Nick was looking down at the oversized battery in his hands, clearly to avoid having to look anywhere else. Vince sighed. I guess I'll do this part. Without hesitation, he opened the first of many doors holding the mortuary's current clientele. The first two drawers held women, Vince could tell without even having to look at the toe tags. The third and fourth drawers were empty, and the fifth held the prize. Vince pulled the steel tray all the way out. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, I give you the late Mr. Swedberg. And he pulled off the sheet with a flourish of a magician. Nick and Caitlin cautiously approached as Vince inspected him. He had the standard look of death, nothing remarkable about him or the disposition of his remains. Sometimes, Vince said, pointing to Swedberg's face, they've got one eye open and it's like they're winking at you. Caitlin let out an audible shudder at the thought. Just do it, said Nick, holding out the battery. Vince fished in his pockets for the insulated wires, attached one end to each to the wet cell, and held the other ends over Swedberg's chest. He took a deep breath, realizing this was nothing like a fish or a frog or a possum. Vince knew this would truly be a life-defining moment for him. Life-defining and death-defying, he thought, in a very literal way. Then he touched the electrodes to Swedberg's chest. The most annoying thing about being reanimated, Alfred Swedberg was quick to discover, was not the foul mood one finds oneself in, nor was it the acrid smell of embalming fluid. Instead, it was a sudden and overpowering craving for corned beef and cabbage, both of which are good sources of iron. Since the dead are anemic, what with their blood being drained and all, the oft referred to zombie penchant for human brains is nothing more than a legitimate craving that could easily be satisfied with spinach. What the hell's wrong with you? Swedberg asked. Can't you see I'm busy? Swedberg spontaneously knew that he was dead. Realization of one's own death must be a universal component of reanimation, although further research would be required to prove it. Mr. Swedberg, said a girl. He didn't recognize her at first because of the angle of his views, somewhat upside down. We're sorry to bother you, but you were going to give us some important information before that is to say, before I was murdered? Is that what you were trying to say? So it was murder, said the boy standing next to her, holding some square apparatus that Sweetberg immediately knew was the source of his unexpected life energy. Now he identified two of the kids. They had come to see him shortly before his death, young Caitlin Westfield and Nick something, and it made him furious. Why should I talk to you? It's because of you that I was killed. I had so many plans, so many years ahead of me. Not any more, said the boy, holding the electrodes to his chest. The best you can do now is make a difference. Maybe even point the finger at the people who did this to you. Sweetberg had less interest in vengeance than in getting back to being deceased, from which he had been so rudely interrupted. But it was obvious this trio was not going anywhere until he gave them something. Fine, he said. He tried to cross his arms, but found them both very stiff, as if he had double tennis elbow that no amount of physical therapy could cure. And though his jaw felt a little bit looser, this conversation was a struggle. No post-mortem personage should be suggested to. Please, Mr. Sweetberg, said Nick, we need to know about the Accelerate. Do you have any idea what they'll do to me? Sweetberg asked. Uh, what more could they do to you? Asked Caitlin. Sweetberg had to admit she had a point. If I tell you, will you let me rest in peace already? They nodded, and so he began. And whoever said dead men tell no tales had never met Alfred Sweetberg. My grandfather wasn't just a jeweler, he was a gemologist. He studied precious gems. He actually synthesized the first artificial diamond, which you call cubic zirconia. He never got credit. As a member of the Accelerati, he was bound to a code of anonymity. Although he was supposed to speak of it, not even never supposed to speak of it, not even to his family, he confided in me just days before he died. The Accelerati began more than 100 years ago, according to my grandfather. It was an honor society created by the man history claims to be the greatest inventor of all time, Thomas Alva Edison. As the story goes, Edison grew tired of the pompous posturing and mundane concerns of other wealthy businessmen. He wanted a society of intellectuals, scientists, inventors, and great thinkers who could and would change the world. But from the very beginning, Edison had an agenda. The Accelerati were never about enlightenment. They were the dark side of genius, the secret shadow of invention. For the Accelerati, it always was and always will be about power, not some vague idealistic grasp at control. No, but power in the literal sense. Electricity, fuel, the very energy that drives our world. Edison's goal was to control everything from production to delivery to consumption, and he almost succeeded. There is a reason why nearly every American power company has Edison as part of its name. Oh, there was no question that he was brilliant, both as an inventor and a businessman, but he fell one level short of the genius it would take to truly master the world's energy supply. That's why he created the Accelerati, co-opting the brain power of some of the world's greatest minds who were the equals of Einstein, Fermi, or Bohr, but names you'll never hear of because the Accelerati's vow of anonymity. It was they who detonated the first atomic bomb a mile beneath Harvard years before Oppenheimer began his experiments. It was they who broadcast the first television signal when the public was just beginning to accept radio. And when a member went astray, it was they who, like the hand of God, would wipe that person out and sometimes their entire neighborhood in a freak accident or natural disaster that had nothing natural about it at all. It was a warning to the members that crossing the Accelerate was met with the severest of consequences. Even after Edison was gone, the Accelerati continued their quest for energy, with results as glorious as microwave transmission and disasters like Chernobyl. My grandfather played the loyal member to protect his family long after he realized what they were. Once they had the secret patent on the artificial diamond, one of many ways to finance their cause. The Accelerati had little use for him, so they let him be. It was an attempt to harness geothermal energy that did them in. In their arrogance, they had gathered in 1980 to witness the dawn of a new era, toasting their own brilliance as their geothermal energy engine tapped the core of dormant volcano. It malfunctioned and the Accelerati were killed in the resulting explosion, an event known to the world as the eruption of Mount St. Helens. Some years later, my grandfather died thinking the Accelerati were gone, disappearing into their own most deserved anonymity. I thought so too, until you brought me that pin. I should have picked up and left at that very moment. I was foolish enough to think they might not be watching, but they're always watching. I saw him through the glass door of my shop shortly after you left, a tall man in a white shirt with a remote control in his hand. Did you know that a universal remote control can be recalibrated to the electrical signature of a human heart? No, neither did I. The dead man was silent after that, looking rather sour about the whole thing. Nick was both relieved by the light he had cast and terrified of its scope. Tesla and Edison hated each other, Nick pointed out. Envy, Swedberg said. It's a powerful motivator. Tesla had what Edison lacked, the highest level of transcendental genius. He was one scientist who could have made all of Edison's dreams come true. The Accelerati were always trying to get their hands on his secret inventions, but they never could. Nick looked at the others, but they kept their eyes fixed on Swedberg, who laughed as something seemed to occur to him. My grandfather told me a legend that the greatest of Tesla's inventions are hidden right here in Colorado Springs, disguised as ordinary household items. He shook his head. People will believe anything. Then he paused for a moment, his smile fading, as he turned his eyes to the wet cell that was, for the moment, keeping him alive. Oh, was all he said. Caitlin then pulled the diamond ring out of her pocket, the last remnant of the man's shop, and she placed it in his hand, forcing the stiff fingers to close around it. Nick could see her eyes were filled with tears. I'm so sorry, Mr. Swedberg, she said. You're here because of me. I did this to you, and I'll never forgive myself. Well, young Miss Westfield, because you and your mother have always been so kind to me, I'll give you something few people, if any, ever receive absolute forgiveness from beyond the grave. Technically, offered Vince, you're not in the grave yet. You shouldn't be so rude to a man in my condition, said Swedberg. Now, if you'll excuse me. And then he reached out, pulled away both of the electrodes touching his chest, and got back to the business of being permanently out of business.